Okay, it is still Thursday, the 16th, or 7th, what are we at, 16th?
16.
Yeah, yeah, all right. I was telling a story earlier about doing a event in Austin during South by Southwest and a whole week of events and stuff, and it just seems like, it's all strung in one noodle. And everybody came out. It was a music concert festival, and very similar to this, where people from all over the world come in, and we're able to share an art project that we're doing and create this mechanism that is social enterprise.
Good introduction.
Thank you. Man, I appreciate you and just believing in this, and it's one of those things when you just you feel right, it's there, and the subject matter of this book is pretty cerebral, and I want, in this process, I want to unpack this by first unpacking you, right? Mm-hmm. And I had asked you before, was that your name? Was that your birth name? Because I was born 10 Kadal, but in the temple in Thailand, the monks, they named me Pirapong. And my lineage name is Chunchamno, Pilapong Chunchamno. So that's a temple name. And then my modern self is 10 Kadal, right? And throws to the many elements of what your story and your book's about. But let's start with that. So, let's unpack you, right? Yes. You're right now in Savannah.
Right.
And you said, man, that's one of the ghostiest towns.
Yes.
Where were you born?
Yes, I'm born out of Savannah, Georgia. I'm a Gullah Geechee baby. That's what they call us, Gullah Geechees. And my family comes off of two islands that are on the coast of Georgia. One is called St. Catherine's Island, and the other is called Skidaway Island. And it is kind of ironic that, well, not ironic, it's the understanding of the history of that on St. Catherine's Island, on Skidaway Island, these are mounds. So these are mound temple islands. And so there's a story behind that. But my grandfather comes from the St. Catherine, the Liberty County area. My grandmother comes from a Fambos that come off of Skidaway Island area. They all meet up into a place called Pinpoint. When the storms came, they had to leave off of the islands. And then on another part of the story is someone sold them a boat motor, and they did not understand kind of like a compound interest. And in those days, they were mostly bartering and trading. So if somebody sells you something at a compound interest, you really can't really recover on that level based on how their exchange was. So they lost the eye. Pinpoint is called Beulah, Cuba, but some people call it Pinpoint today, but originally it was called Beulah, Cuba. Most people would not know why those older people would call it Beulah, Cuba. But if you know the history of it, then you'll say, wow, hold up. Well, there's a history that's really not told about Georgia, the Gullah Geechees, and so forth. And part of the history is some of our families came in off of straight from the slave boats from Africa. But some of our families had already been trotting from Africa, traveling in boats, and were here. Okay? So there were groups that were here that were taken as slaves from the islands, brought into South Carolina. They became some of the most rebellious ones. So that was a thing that they really kind of realized. But prior to that, the first stage of colonialism that came into the Georgia and the islands areas was by Spanish. And so the Spanish came in and they did missionaries. So in the missionaries, most of the families in them started learning from the missionaries, and the names of the areas became known based on the missionaries. So this is how you would know how old this family was and how long they'd been here, because if they don't know the missionary names, then they came in later on the boats, and those that got caught in with the missionaries, those was the ones that was already here, and the first wave was missionaries. So then they came to know the areas under like Beulah, Cuba. So I grew up in a Gullah Geechee community with a very rich.
Important to remember. What is it that it needs to be known that is relevant today?
Well, I put it in a sense of with me with my locks now. Most people will just associate the locks with the word Rastafari. But the word also goes with Nazarite, the vow of the Nazarite. It's a separated one. And when you read the history of the people who they were called Nazarenes or the Nazarites, they stayed on the outskirts. They became known as the Qumrans, the Essenes, the Maccabees, and so forth. But these were the ones that stayed on the outskirts for a certain reason. So here in America, you still had this same archetype happening. So the Gullah Geechees were the ones that stayed on the outskirts. And they were to keep certain traditions. And the traditions were to be preserved. Now, the traditions, when they were given to us and where we go to at a certain point of time to where people don't even know why they do certain things, then when people start to forget and they start to just let those things go, those traditions were messages, they were things for us to preserve that just disappears. Now that's why knowing and writing this story, The Black Rose of Kush, was so important, because when I grew up, I would go outside and sit by the old men when they was outside cooking crab and doing the fish, and they coming in off of the boats, and we would sit out there at nighttime. That was the privilege, to be able to sit outside in the dark under the stars with the old men while they were doing the thing. But that's when they would sit down around the fire and they would talk, they would teach you. You know, they had their moonshine too, you know, but that's when they talk and they teach you. So we had oral traditions. And we also had in our societies things called pen societies. You know, the old people tell you, if they come get you in the nighttime, see, it's not the, you know, some people say, oh, you're talking about the Klan or something. No. In our communities, you had where people would come get you in the nighttime, and you would be initiated in a certain knowledge. They would take you out in the bush, they would take you to the graveyard or take you to the river, and whatever procedure they were going to, wherever they had it set up, that's where you would go. And so we were given certain information and knowledge, but those traditions, they started dying. Well, not to go too far, let me tell you about one. When I was young, it stopped, but we seen it, but it stopped. They used to put all white on it, and they used to take people down to the river to be baptized. But people would say, well, that's regular. No. What they used to do was, the children or the kids who was to go, they would have to go sit by this a certain tree. But they would go through 7 days of purification. They don't do nothing, they don't let the kids do nothing, they stay in the house. And they monitor the kids for the dreams. When one of the children have a dream that they believe is a vision and it comes true, They know this is the one, or this is supposed to be like a seer. They know this is the one.
Mm.
So they used to do these traditions.
Mm.
And
Mm.
in that process, when my mother came up, she was one that had the vision. But she'd seen one of her cousins die. And later on, the cousin drowned. And my mama didn't want to see them. So really you watch how later on these traditions kind of just fade away. And then people stop putting the white on, going to the river. They ain't even put the kids by the tree. Nobody don't even remember no more that they used to make the kids go to the tree, that they used to make them go 7 days in the house to go through a purification to see who would be the seer. Now you would have to say now, where would they get a tradition to know how to look for a seer? Where would that come from? But you would say, well, they going through Christianity, they doing the church, what they doing, and they going and they singing the hymn, but they got traditions mixed within that you can't understand them.
Was that your motivation to start writing?
Yes.
I mean, did it come out where you were thinking it was going to be 4 novels?
No, I didn't think it was going to be 4 novels. It came out to where I missed it. So when the old men took me, took another one of my cousins and another one of my cousins, only 2 of them I know, because you know, like you don't really know everybody that go till everybody tell you. So it was only 2 I seen. And both of them died in prison. Jonathan Haynes and the Kia family. And I said, man, them the only ones I know. I know the old men, but all the old men done died. My grandfather, big man, Fusky, oh man. And they told us how to build boats. This is how it started. They were boat builders.
So this is the legacy
Never,
threaded in.
right, never understood it when we was young. We wanted to go to the skate ring. We wanted to put the fat tennis shoes, shoestrings in the tennis shoes and go bebop and pop and block. You know, them old men talking about, come, go cook crab and build boat, man. You know, once I cook crab, man, I can't even go to the mall. I can smell like crab for 2 days. You know? So we used to run from them. And they trying to teach us something. But we thinking the world has something for us. And they had stayed separated to be able to hand these traditions down. This is why they stayed there. This is why, you had the bricklayers, you had the plumbers. These was the master craftsmen. If you went down into the Gullah Geechee, this is where you found all the master craftsmen. This is where they came to go get them. Well, why do you think all of them was the master craftsmen? So they used to tell us certain things. They say we was the boat builders. You know, when you're young, you don't understand. They the boat builders. Boat builders, they boat builders. But my grandfather used to always say, ain't no slave master taught us how to build a boat. So you have to wonder, how do you hand down, in the process of slavery, a boat building tradition without getting killed? Because every time you look like you're just teaching somebody, it look like you're teaching them to get away. So that's an unexplainable. So how do you hand it down? So it was like, man, you know, we young, and when they tell you certain things, they telling you got to be an upright and certain things, and you think, oh, these people trying to make us a deacon. They trying to make us, you know, you young, you like, oh, they trying to make us be, you know, you want to be. You looking at the world wanting to be hip. So I missed the message first.
Hold on.
I missed
How did that make you feel when
realized it in prison totally. I realized it before, but I really realized it in prison. And I was looking around and I was watching this system that's arresting all of these brothers who are fighting from poverty. But also, we are dealing with a system that says it's dealing with justice, but yet there is no justice in it. The abuse, the miscarriages of justice, the illogical things that are done that are so corrupt in the courts. And it's like, then you realize what the old man was trying to teach you. Stay on your course. Because it was something else you had to do. Don't get lost. There's something else you got to do. Not the illusions of life right now. We couldn't hear them because that's you thinking you want to obtain knowledge. They're trying to give you some gifts of knowledge so that you can be equipped to deal with the true reality in which you live in. Because if your knowledge is limited, your ability to deal with your environment and the situations is limited. If your knowledge is based on just trying to find a conditioning of feeling value, because that's what we were taught from TV to music, was an exterior of trying to find value in the exterior world, such as if we bought these certain cars, if we got these certain clothes, if we did this, then that was the value system. And so it became individual greatness over the reality of healing and building the community. So the one thing that was bred into the Gullah Geechee community was it was a collective. We was family. If you came down there, it was cousin, oh, that's my cousin there, that's the cousin up the road, oh, that's my aunt there. And you'd be like, well, hold up, everybody on the street? Yeah, everybody on the street family. Everybody? Everybody. So it was a collective, and it was such a collective that I could have go all the way up the street and ate dinner all day long.
So how did you, knowing how you missed the first, how did you prepare yourself for the second book then? And then also, it's almost kind of like looking at it, you know, how do you reapproach it again, also to step back into it? You know, it's almost kind of like an art piece that you got to do over again. I mean, how did you work that in your mind for that, right? I mean, it's like, okay, here's the second book, and there's, you know, you end up with a novel 4. So unpack that.
All right, so what really started taking place was I was looking at the reality of which we were suffering as a people. And as I was seeing this, I'm looking at the divisions in the many states of mind, how we were divided by religion, how we were divided by all of these different types of concepts. And as I said, even though I missed it, I still started my journey in certain studies. So there were things that were given to us like songs and drawings, symbols. And one of the symbols was, and this is how things increased, they used to draw the bottom of a boat around. And for years, that's all I ever seen. Until when I knew that the bottom of the boat, but another statement that we were given was keepers of the way, keepers of the door. So one day I'm looking at the symbol of the bottom of the boat, and I realized, because I'm studying something else, and I'm looking at it, and I said, hold on. This the Kabbalistical, it's the Kabbalah's tree of life. It's the bottom of the boat. so it was, so now I'm looking at the bottom of the boat because I remember them drawing the archway over the boat. And I used to always wonder if it was the sun supposed to be in front of the boat, but it was an archway. So now I'm seeing that the tree of life is the doorway to Solomon's temple. So this is the two pillars, Boaz and Joshin, the kingly priestly pillar. So as I start to go into the studies, I'm looking at the history and I'm listening to the things that the elders said now. You know, because before you can't hear it because your mind not ready. You can't want for people what they don't want for themselves. So even though you could speak to someone, they might not hear them, but the seeds is planted. So the seeds was planted, so then as you start to play it back, and you learn this history and you understanding it. So in my grandfather's side, they got a lot of them. They're freedmen coming out of what they call the Liberty County Midway area. But, and you could look this up in the Midway area of Liberty County, you got the Eddie Bowen Museum. That's my grandfather's mother's brother. Well, Ma Eva, which is Eddie's sister, used to call Ma Eva Indian. But Ma Eva was not Indian as you would say Indian. They say Indy, like West Indies. So this is how our people say West Indies. So this is how we understand our peoples come off of the islands and being brought in. So the history of the boat builders, with my grandfather, is that they were builders of boat builders who came from Aksum, Ethiopia. The Aksumites traveled the world. They were boat builders. And they sailed to Peru. And they built and they lived in Peru in South America. And they sailed from Peru to the islands here on the borders of America. And they set up again. So when the colonialism wave came, these are families and traditions that were in South America and that were here, that have been here for years. But they came with a lot of ancient ways. So in the midst of this, even through the years, they had maintained what's called pen societies. These are their own orders, just like they had pen societies. And in the societies, this were the oral traditions were. And this was not understood to me that this oral traditions was a keeper of an ancient story of our people and the connections with the multiple sciences, with the multiple religions, that all of it balanced out. So then when I started paying attention, now I can hear it now. We used to sing a song, and it referred to Nana Baluku. Nana Baluku, she no widow, she the son of the cosmos. Nana Baluku, Nana Baluku. And in the song was what made our societies different. Is Nana Baluku states, we are not a widowed son because the king is not dead. Because Nana Baluku is the cosmic mother of creation. She is matter. She is everything. So if her love, which is spirit, that's her oneness. If her lover, if her king is dead, then spirit is dead in matter. So we are not the children of those who are dead without spirit, you know? So it was a different lesson.
You had been able to take what was of a oratory and a storytelling circle
Mm-hmm.
and put it into written form,
Yes. Yes.
and to preserve what had been now without the traditional family of your people and your tribe to do this. So it was, in essence, immortalizing. And so is there power in reading your book out loud?
I would say there's power in reading anything out loud when there is the intent in the heart behind it.
And I say that specifically because you said from your tradition, it was all oral, and I wonder if that, because it's, subconsciously known that you're writing this, and that there's moments, just like how you sang for us,
Yeah.
that there's, spaces where this should be read out loud. If there's, within that you've preserved, because you said like that you missed it the first time,
Mm-hmm.
and then you came back, and then it gave it more of a purpose structure, and it came out to 4 novels.
Right. It's a product. I would say it's a prodigal son journey. It's like losing your way and coming back and understanding. Wow, they gave me all the jewels at the start.
Mm.
That's a weight. It's like, oh man, I done run out here trying to get the answer, and they gave me the answer. Now, I'll tell you on a living testimony how this is too. Because there's no more old men out there to do it, and the kids not outside no more, they had the video game. So even if the old man was sitting out there by outside with the fire burning, kids not outside no more. So it had to been a way that those messages and those answers could be conveyed. So I took urban stories, urban characters, who then learning now from understanding the archetypes, because what they gave us was, it's like a map, and you got to know the scale to be able to know how to use the map. And they give us the scale. And so these symbolisms, you learn them as archetypes. You learn them in the languages of archetypes, but they have a whole science and a dimension of them. Because, and I always have to say this, because no matter what you do, never read nothing on a flat line. And I say this like, if I tell you that the story of Adam and Eve is just the story of a man and a woman in the past, is there anything you could do about it? Is there anything, can it come out? No, it's a dead story. So if it's a dead story, it becomes a dead letter. But if you understood that Adam and Eve wasn't a story about just a man and a woman, that Adam and Eve was actually atom and Eve is matter, and that Adam is energy that can neither be destroyed nor created, that's spirit manifesting into matter, and that our physical world is really a spiritual world, and that what deceives us is that serpentine energy in us searching for a completion and for a desire. So that serpent talks to our Eve, to our feminine, until we are deceived of our own reality. So some would say it was a woman, but there's not a woman deceived man. So the story, when you understand it in the dimensions, it's a building block. But if it's just about a man and a woman in the past and you flatline it, You know, if you go to the hospital and they say something's flatline, it's dead. So you have to see the dimensions in the stories. So our ancestors never wrote a story without dimensions. Without dimensions. So the story of the Black Rose of Kush was to reopen those dimensions of the minds back to the youth, as the oral traditions was to open to us, as it was to open us to the gateways of ourself and initiate us into the truth of ourself, so that we may carry on the legacy that we were birthed here for eternally.
You know, you were saying in your first book, and if I heard you right, you said you were in prison, and so, you know, this whole process of writing, that's going on in your life. You have a moment to stop and where you're like, I missed it. You're sitting in jail. How old were you? How long did it take you to finish that first book, by the way? And how old were you when you were sitting in prison?
I was 26 to 40. Well, 39. Yeah. 26 to 39. And I actually wrote 13 books. And 4 plays, a book of poems, and I have a set of books called Temple Building. And what I did with temple building was the very knowledge that as I started seeing in the archetypes and the symbols, and as I started doing the investigation, and this is why my book is called The Black Rose of Kush. As I started doing the investigation and seeing this Kushite truth that our ancestors had held, and that the Gullah Geechee had represented the connection in the West as well as the connection in the East. It was to break those borders of division and bring back that oneness. Because, I mean, there's more in our understanding of things than I could convey, but there have been a lot of changes even on the world, and those changes have been recorded. There are things that our people are unaware of because of things became taboo when we wanted to fit in and not. You know, one of a great movie that kind of describes it is done by one of the first black female directors, Julie Dash. What is it? Yes, it is. Julie Dash. Man, Daughters of the Dust. Okay. Well, I get her film right. Daughters of the Dust. And when you see that film, you can kind of see in the storyline how the Gullah Geechee were living on the outskirts and on the islands, and we were looking at the city life thinking it was better. And so when those things of wanting to fit in, we dropped a lot of traditions. And so, as you said, the key in the whole book in the Black Rose of Kush was to not just say traditions, but the traditions, if you just say the traditions, you flatline. You understand? What was the dimensions in the traditions? What was that hidden story that they were really conveying? Because if you just flatline it, then you kind of miss it.
You miss the transcendence.
Right.
And that's the thing that I think that, I think it's really profound, is that you have this of a melancholy, of a knowledge that was of community and of people. And modern day technology, and you've, like you said, you're not missing the point, but flatlining it will lose it, and then being able to transcend, and that is what you made in that pivot of taking of your oral tradition that was no more of people and community, and you went into written form with it and structured it in a way that a modern audience can read. And the other scope of what you also believe in conversations, and this is very interesting too, because we're going from like traditional oral tradition that is no computer, no technology, and we're talking about blockchain. We're talking about those mechanisms. There's this radical shift of what was of just being around in a campfire of no electricity, and to embrace it, and being here, having the knowledge put into a book, and transcending and not flatlining it, and keeping it within the ether.
Yeah.
And so that's a very interesting whole process. And you know the writing, and so doing so, I mean, did you already have a passion for it? Did it get deeper when you're there and you're going through all this in your own self of what you had accomplished in the first book? How was that for you? I mean, obviously you have all that was written out. It says how much writing and literature has been for you.
Well, I actually started writing before prison. I actually wrote my first book in elementary school.
Mm.
My sister would sit here and laugh to you and tell you, because I used to write scary books to scare her and my little cousin. And but it was kid books, and I wrote this book called The Umbrella People, and it was based on our neighborhood, because it was little stories about, you had them, like, I tell you, Savannah's a ghost, is like ghost stories. So we got things that happen in our neighborhood. So the story I wrote was really called like The Umbrella People, and it was supposed to be like some little skinny little umbrella shaped like people, but and it was, if you heard the whistle, like at nighttime, because we used to walk in our neighborhood dark down the street, wasn't no street lights like that, so it'd be dark. And so the thing was to tell them about the story about walking down the street, and if you heard the whistle, it's the umbrella people coming. And I wrote it and wrote a whole section on it, and I used to tell them the story, and they used to love it, and she'd laugh about it. But I wrote about 3 books like that, because it was just I don't know, that was my nature then, all the way in elementary school. And the next thing in elementary school, I also was I got hooked on Greek and Roman mythology, especially when I cross-referenced and seen Ares, the god of war, was the same thing as the name in the zodiac. So it started pushing my mind, and inspiration came from not just that, but also from my mother.
Mm.
My mother's a miracle. Doctors talk about my mother, and so I seen this as a young age as well. So my mother's named Mary, and so Mother Mary. My mother was diagnosed with MS in the early 80s, and they told her that she would be a vegetable. Like, they tell you you're going to break down and you're going to be on a breathing machine. I watched my mom get yoga books, meditation. You had the cassette player headsets that they put on, right? Put the headsets on back then, and put those verbal, that constant say things to yourself, affirmations, And she would always say, they diagnose, ain't my diagnose. And she would constantly do those things. So she was an activator of it, right? And today doctors look at her and they say, because she's still walking, still working, and she's 70-something years old.
Mm.
And that was in the 80s. So to them, according to them, she wasn't supposed to make it out of the 80s. She was supposed to, before the 80s got over, she was supposed to be paralyzed or something. She's not. Now she has certain things that bother, but when they do their test, they try to figure it out. So it was her that would always say the God within. So by her reinforcement, then on the other side with the grandfather and taking the knowledge and all of that, then it was understanding the totality of the lesson.
Mm.
It was like the activation was real. It wasn't a question. It was like, okay, you know,
This is your responsibility.
yeah, this, and look at the power that she showed you that this is in y'all. This is what you're supposed to do. Then going back to the story, she was actually a seer. And she chose not to because of when she had seen her cousin die. So understanding what was in us and what we were supposed to be doing then became, the Black Rose of Kush became a different type of riding now.
Mm.
It became a responsibility. And so now this book took its own embodiment, it took its own spirit. So it went from the archetypes into it, and it developed and it developed. But one of the things, as I said, is as I learned the scales, the archetypes, I created another set of books called Temple Building. And so when you read the Black Rose of Kush, it's an urban fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's a serious urban fiction, but it takes you into the dimensions of the stories and into the science. And as I would say, it's a magic book. It's to unlock the Akashic records in the mind. And so when you read it and you get identified with these archetypes and they start to build in your emotions and you crane into your emotions, it also prepares the mind for the next book, which is the temple building, which would then allow you to see the temple building language that was written all throughout the urban fiction. Now you see that even though it's an urban fiction, those characters have dimensions. They're signs and symbols themselves. So it was a whole calculation to teach that dimensional seeing.
When you were in that place of being able to see what you were supposed to write, did you do what we were talking about earlier? Was there a channeling? Were there ancestors there? How was that means of writing different?
Well, as I said earlier, the vow of the Nazarite, which is Rastafari. And while I was in the federal prison doing my time, I was a strong advocate for, as I learned the activation was real, I was a strong advocate for an ITIL, which is called like an ITIL kosher diet, meaning it's a vegan, total vegan, same way you fix kosher, can't be no knives that cut with meat, and so it was an ITIL kosher diet. So in the prison system, they would not provide this for Rastas. They would provide for every other religion, but they wouldn't give the Rastas their religious diet. So me, I would not eat the food if you would not prepare it that way. And they had placed me in the hole, and I did 81 days without food. I went from 190 pounds to 108 pounds. I had actually fell out and hit my head on a steel bump and split it open. Had to get 27 staples. They took me to the hospital and stapled my head back, brought me right back, and still wouldn't provide the food. I stayed like that from when the head injury to about 45, maybe more days before they were corrected. But during that time period, that fast, that meditation, you know, that inner cleanse, even from the head injury to the bleeding, you know, they did not, I was, from that head injury, I was pretty much paraplegic. I couldn't walk. I couldn't stop shaking. I couldn't stop. I had body impairments that I couldn't stop. And I had to train myself. There was no rehab, no rehabilitation. Nobody was not doing this now. So I had to train myself to come back from that. So that's when I went into a deeper state of meditation. The fasting had already brought me to another level in a certain level in the purification. And also knowing that I was being persecuted at this time for just nothing bad, for just purely food. That I knew eating this way protected the self. It shifted the consciousness to another level. And I could say that it placed my writing into a higher level as well. It definitely did that. It triggered the writing into it.
When you wrote, did you wrote? How, was it hours? How was it that where there was no time? It was.
Yeah, I could write for hours. Now, book 4 is like a complete episode, epic in itself. I could catch the vision of the book because of the archetypes and of the signs, and I could go sit to the typewriter and go through the whole book almost. If no one would stop me, if I would be able to go that whole thing without nothing bothering me and stopping me, I could go through it. Now, I could be writing it, and I could get past the point of where I wrote it, and it still would just keep going. Because of that, I was putting out. I would do outlines though. Let me say that. Let me get that right. I would do an outline first, like the idea would hit, the vision would hit. I would outline it, place in this character, and see how the story would etch through. But then when I would sit down to completely write or type or do anything, I could fill in all of that from just the outline. So that was meaning that once I could see it, I could hear it, then I could just hear the story. I could see the story.
And we talked before about the psychological, psychology of personas, the archetypes. And there's that, and you're doing right brain, left brain as you're mapping this out. And let's go back to that psychology and then that background that you had and how you knew that you were able to communicate this. Let's get back to that a little bit of history, because I know there's, you're very active in the political front, very involved with people in community that's doing high-level things in sustainability, working with government. So I don't want to get too far in that, but I want to get back to understanding how, okay, I have this depth of psychology and this that I know can be effective in wrapping this together and then creatively still doing it and unpacking that into, and I love the way you said it because you said you did a framework.
Right. And that's you exactly on point with. I'm glad you asked me that. In analyzing the stories, everything is written for a strategy, for an accomplished goal. It's not written for an entertaining, because I could have written a regular, discrete novel. The characters are designed to take the consciousness, I said, into an Akashic record, but also to combat this a social engineering. It's like a countermeasure. I've always been told to overcome something, you must have an equal force or a greater force. So if we know that social engineering is films, music, propaganda, that stereotype, that set a mentality and cultivate a thought process in the youth that leave their consciousness in a like a lower frequency, and their vision of life and their vision of the world is encapped into these archetypes of stereotypes that they're creating. Then to counter them, you have to bring into a character that awakens something different into the minds of the youth, that take them to where it equips them to where it counteracts the many of the components of fight or flight, because you have to understand in just the basic science of the HPA, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal, that it affects our community in multiple ways. The statement, "My people perish due to a lack of knowledge," is not a void statement. So where you have a lack of knowledge, you don't have an understanding. When you don't have an understanding, see everything is in a desperate state. You're in a chaotic state because you can't understand why is this. You can't calculate it. So that means tomorrow seems perilous. Now, if you have people living in this perilous mindset and they're living into a state to where they have envisioned their self through a value system, through a religious systems, through social systems that have them equating not just their value of their self, but their perception of what their future can hold for them through just a basic history that denies them any way of breaking free from the fight or flight. So when we say that, it's a terminology called post-traumatic slave syndrome. So most people would think that what happened to the ancestors in the past don't have nothing to do with today, but it does. And it's affecting, and it's got triggers, and that's where you go into understanding epigenetics, epigenomes, and that if I have traumatized you and about 3 generations of your family, for years you've all created a certain genetical coding in your brain. You've turned certain epigenetics on. You've got certain response systems that's on you. Certain things are functioning in you. And so if you are going through life to where you're living in this, and this affects your hormones. So if everyone's living in a hormone disbalance, tomorrow seems perilous. They're already in fight or flight, so that means everything is going to be a response as in fight or flight. The brain is not able to assess in fight or flight to really think on a certain way. The stomach is out of balance, so everything feels giggly. So when you look at this, you look at our communities and you see a fire pit. You see the kettle is set to make the communities always explode in violence, in hate, in desperation. So that means we're vulnerable for drug epidemics. Why? The drugs were supposed to make you feel better. So if you're stressed and you feel you didn't burn up all your dopamines. So this is all it is. So how do you counter this, all of this thought process?
Right.
How do you counter all of these measures? How do you start so in each of the characters is developed storylines.
Within these challenges, that's waking them up to this thing that's a trigger that they're seeing in every day that's going on.
Every day, and to then give them a greater story to place their visual of their self above that energy, above that frequency.
And explaining what like epigenetics is, explaining and having them being able to recognize this a basic understanding. This is where you're going back talking about your ancestors and
right.
that information that they are within themselves that they're disconnected from.
Right.
And
that's
being enslaved to that slavery system and not seeing their abilities to break it from the means of epigenetics.
So this will go to your question earlier about if reading your book out loud would have an effect. So when we say epigenetics and we're talking about zeros and ones, there's a terminology called geomnecy. Geomancy. But in Yoruba, the characters in which you would call for geomnecy, they're called the 16 candles. And these 16 markers, when you use them in a calculation of certain variables, how you deal with them, it brings them to a calculation of 256. So in the reading systems, you will hear that say 256 odus. But this 256 goes with your DNA, with your genetics. The 16 candles and all of this is DNA, genetic, epigenetic science. So our ancestors would know how to understand the epigenetics of you from doing the reading on you.
Right.
Okay? So it would seem like science has found something advanced. But just as you was asking earlier, I was born to the name Bruce. But my Ori, my head, my head is Babaluai. So I am Lazaro, Saint Lazarus. I am Lazarus. So in my reading, the reading gave me the name, but my name Lazarus came before my reading. My name Lazarus came before my reading because my name Lazarus, Azarel, Nazarai, is a triune of Azar, Azar, Azar. A-Z-A-R. A-Z-A-R is the seraphim. Azar is the highest of the seraphim. The seraphim goes to the Aries. I am an Aries, a rain. So when you start seeing, that's why I say everything is got dimensions. So even in the name Lazarus, which was attributed in another way, in the reading of the Ori and in studying your birthright, it still revealed that that was the name. And what most don't know is when you study geomancy and you look back on it, you're going to find the traces of geomancy through many civilizations. This is how you're going to know the ancient connections. Most Christians don't even know that the one thing that they say that they believe in was never prophesied by an Israelite, a Christian, or a Hebrew. It was prophesied according to the Christian tradition, the Israelites, they call him a sorcerer. They call him a magician. But his name is Balaam. 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 Balaam is the one who prophesies the coming of a star, not the coming of Jesus. They took the story and changed that it would be the coming of Jesus. But when you study the story of Balaam, you will miss it in the regular traditional Bible. You have to get the Ethiopian Dejum Shor. It's an Ethiopian script that was found in the Sudan area, and it explains to you something that has been hidden for a long time. But down in the bushes, Savannah, Georgia, the old men taught it. They taught this order of Melchizedek. They taught this Kushite truth. They taught this connection of a priesthood that had extended from Africa all the way even to America. They taught that if you study about the Mayan or the Aztecs and the Olmecs, you'll find out that all of their priests were called Balaam. And they wore the leopard print, just as they wear in Africa. And so when you find out about Balaam, you find out that Balaam is a grandson of Melchizedek. See, Melchizedek had children. Oh, yes, he, without father, without mother, without beginning of end. Yes, he is the eternal. Spirit became matter. Matter is spirit. This is a spiritual realm. Why would our ancestors describe something outside of eternal if they still was in that mindset? Now we're in a different mindset. We might describe life different. But the truth of life is the truth of life. So when you get to this story, you find out that Balaam is a descendant of Ethiop, or Ethel, Melchizedek's children. And Ethiop, had 13 children. And they became kingdoms. Kingdoms. So they became kingdoms in Syria, kingdoms in Armenia, kingdoms in Edom. They were kingdoms in India. They were kingdoms in America. They were kingdoms in China. They were kingdoms all over. But this man, Balaam, they called him a sorcerer. But when you study it, it would make no sense that you would call this man a sorcerer, but yet they would say he is the one who brings forth the word of God. Then you say, well, he shouldn't be the one, but he is the one he's bringing forth. So what's wrong? But nobody ever says who Balaam really is. So if Balaam is a sorcerer, and he's considered not Israel, so where is Melchizedek? So when you go to the Yoruba tradition, the Yoruba, there's a book called Jesusism by Akin Biyoko. In the book Jesusism, Akin Biyoko helps expose the fact that in Palestine, or Beishan, or Jerusalem, he is called Melchizedek. But in West Africa, he's called Orumilia, the bringer of divination. So this bringer of divination, the priest, the high priest of the Most High God, when they say the high priest of the Most High God, It was the God of the heavens and the earth, El Elyon. But that's a Canaanite name. The Canaanites were the Kushites. They were Axumites. These was the boat builders. These was the keepers of a doorway, a keeper of a way. And many of them had sailed over this way. And they had these stories that connected all of these stories. And these stories are the Black Rose of Kush. So the title is that history, is that connection that had been broken, and that the restoration of that is maybe a lot deeper than a lot of people will really recognize for a while. But I am a father of children, and the tradition, my children will forever have these stories, and their children will forever have them. And it's been written in archetypes so that it could transcend them. So they don't have to feel disconnected because the story seems out of date to them. So now it's put in a way that they can take it from their experiences and take it into their time. There's a character in there, in the Black Rose of Kush. It's called Mama Sulu. And she is in the story, she runs like what we call a shop house. Sula Bones is a real Mama Sulu. Now she transcended. I wanted her to be here to have got a chance to see the book turned to a film. But she transcended. But Mama Sulu was of the tradition of mamas who were keepers of the community. Like I said, we could walk up and down the street and go to any house and eat. Any house. Ain't too many neighborhoods like that. Ain't too many neighborhoods like that. And then the people gonna tell you, hey, if you hungry, come on here. Don't you be out there being hungry. Ain't too many places like that.
You know, you speak of the, you said this several times, the Akashic records, you know, and the novels are of that, of means of accessing, and you spoke about it, of your children having something forever and transcending. First of all, you know, for those that don't know, what is the Akashic records, and then share a little bit about that means of the self and us moving through the chains that hold us to that truth of the Akashic records, which is what you're expressing through your book.
Well, we was talking earlier, and like I said, I like to allow the mind to think past its limitations. And so when I say Akashic records, I first like to say, as I said earlier, science told us the truth. They told us that an atom is energy that can neither be destroyed nor created. So if an atom is what makes up matter, and you're made up of atom and you're matter, but an atom is energy that can neither be destroyed nor created, then this energy is eternal. So we are made up of eternity. So there's an eternal story inside of you. There's the story of the heavens and the earth and everything. And the universe communicates it to you. But somehow our epigenetics, our zeros and ones in our brains, have turned something on. And we try to channel back into that, that's not always easy. Because sometimes it's hard to make the mind see its eternal self. Because when you start talking about Akashic records, you're trying to make a mind conceive that it has an ancient past. And even though the person may say, yeah, I believe in Akashic records, yeah, but that's deep. But their mind still is saying, I can't see that, I don't see that, how am I gonna see that, what I'm gonna do. So it's like you have to make the mind first conceive its eternal self. Now it's preparing itself to go to that next stage.
When we were talking about this in your book, and we talked about the film festival, you had envisioned, you said that you're moving towards getting it produced into cinema.
Yes.
So, I mean, this has come from like this whole scope of a personal journey, family, and a tradition that you're preserving, going from what can be for your generation, and then now this idea of like, okay, let's go into cinema. And, you know, this multi-dimension of like topics to archetypes to based on Greek, and then, so where was that ambition, where was that support? Because that was pretty amazing to me, that this was something that you had a vision of to get towards cinema.
Yes, as I said, it's to overcome a force, it takes an equal force or a greater force. And when we look at the conditions within our communities, and we look at how television stories are socially engineering the mindsets. So what is a counter set? What can trigger the change? So the story was, okay, yeah, we got it as book form, but I need it to be bigger. We need it to be where it becomes that iconic story that the youth can now start. You know, I remember when Colors came out and there wasn't no real gang banging on the East Coast. I remember when the movie Colors came out and there wasn't no gang banging on the East Coast like that. And I remember after Colors, after Minister Society, not that those, you could fault those stories. I wouldn't say that, because they were teaching a lesson in those stories. They were trying to convey what was the conditions. But then those things became engineered to engineer a certain mindset. So at this stage, that's when I said, okay, well, we need to try to put this into full production, into a film, because it'll reach out to the youth better. And our community. We wanted to tell our Gullah Geechee story in a different way. And I got successful and got the ear of a celebrity director, Indrani Pal Chaduri. She actually did the David Bowie documentary. She's done Lady Gaga, Mary J. Blige, Jay-Z, Beyonce. She's worked with pretty much a lot of the top celebrities. And she's a social activist as well. She's been recognized by the United Nations, and that's how we kind of clicked, is based on it's a community activist kind of component. It's like, yes, we're going to push this because this is going to empower us to do other things to bring change. So that was a very good component coming in. And I think we're on a good way. I also have Nia Simone. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's part of the marketing team.
You know, I mean, it's inspirational in a lot of aspects, to where any author, any person from the perspective before engaging into book, then to the other side of it, to even to this point where it comes to life and moving towards towards cinema and film. I, you know, you said a couple things that was really interesting in regards to like your grandparents and your ancestors, how they know little kids that when they have dreams, and it was a society that was led based on a spiritual ideology, a spiritual process and practice that was scientific. And of our modern day, that country, the last one is Tibet, and they would have the same thing of ceremony where they would see the knowledge of a child and know that was the means of governance.
Right.
So, with that being said, I want to be able to reach back. Jeez,